Ever since I saw the first trailer for Death's Door a couple months ago, I've been really looking forward to its release, and now it's finally out. I was really intrigued by the premise, where a little bird's 9 to 5 corporate job was to go kill dangerous monsters. But the question is, did it meet my expectations? The short answer is yes. You should go buy this game right now. But if you need a bit more convincing, let me tell you about why I recommend Death's Door. Death's Door is an action combat game about a little crow who works as a reaper, fighting monsters to collect souls for his company. Due to some unexpected circumstances, the crow ends up having to explore the world and hunt down 3 powerful souls. In combat, the player has access to a melee weapon, a dodge, and a couple different spells. The spells are also used to unlock different paths and secrets in the world, but I'll talk more about that later. The combat in this game ended up being the part of the experience that I found to be most enjoyable. It's incredibly fun and satisfying to learn the best way to use each weapon and spell, learn which enemies to prioritize, and dodge enemy attacks at the perfect time. It's also clear that some combat arenas had a lot of thought put into them, with certain gimmicks and challenges that really make them memorable and force you to adapt. One of my favorite examples of this is an arena that is entirely on ice, so you have to fight while sliding around the floor. It makes it so you have to be more careful about attacking, because missing can have consequences and end with you sliding into enemies and taking damage. There are other examples like this, but I think it's better if you experience them yourself. I also really like the concept behind the way you heal in Death's Door, but I think the execution could have been a little better. While exploring, you find seeds that can be planted and allow you to restore health. This means you can only heal in certain places, and only if you have the resources to do so. And in the first hour or two, this makes for some really interesting scenarios, where you'll find a pot but have to decide whether or not it's worth using a seed to heal, or if you should try and tough it out to conserve your limited resources. But the problem is that after those first couple hours, you'll likely have so many seeds that the conflict becomes almost non-existent. You end up being able to easily put a seed in almost any pot you find. I'm sure it's really hard to find the perfect balance between making sure players have enough healing and adding some tension to exploration, but I was very disappointed that seeds became so abundant in the second half of the game. Boss battles are another integral part of combat in this game, and they're also one of the best parts. I think the game has a respectable number of bosses, and a lot of them have interesting mechanics to learn. Most bosses have multiple phases, with new attacks being added in as the boss gets closer to dying. It keeps the fight from getting too monotonous, but I will mention that a couple of the bosses felt like they were missing one final phase to really push them to their full potential. I would sometimes get to the final phase and end up disappointed because it either wasn't very different or didn't really increase in challenge at all as the fight went on. I think the strongest endorsement of the bosses I can give is to say that I always looked forward to reaching the end of an area because I knew there would be a cool boss waiting at the end. As for the weapons and spells, I like them, but I did find myself disappointed overall. The main differences between the weapons are how fast you can attack and how many times in a row you can attack without stopping. The only weapon that really has any sort of special effect is the Thunder Hammer, which can do damage to enemies at longer ranges using lightning. The stat differences allow the weapons to feel unique, but I think it would have been nice if each of them had some sort of unique effect like the Thunder Hammer does. As for spells, I like the idea of layering melee combat with ranged options, but I found myself disappointed with the lack of variety between the spells. 3 of the 4 spells are just projectiles that deal damage. There are differences in the amount of damage they do and the time it takes to charge them up, but that's mostly it. The 4th spell is by far the most interesting because it increases your movement options in combat. I would have loved to see more spells like the hookshot that weren't just launching projectiles and actually increased the player's options in some way. Before I fully move away from talking about combat, the last thing I want to mention is that I think the game could greatly benefit from a hard mode. I was satisfied with the difficulty curve overall, but the game was easy enough that I have no interest in replaying it without something more challenging. It feels like there isn't any activity in Death's Door that really pushes the combat system to its limit, although I know there is some stuff to do after you've beaten the game. A hard mode that unlocks after a player has beaten the game for the first time would go a long way. It could be done a couple different ways, but I would have loved to see bosses get an extra final phase that's really challenging, and maybe enemy placements could have been changed to make encounters more difficult. Obviously, that would have taken time and resources, but I think the game would have really benefited from it, because right now, it feels like players like me who are interested in truly mastering this combat system have been left out. Despite the fact that I have some minor issues with the combat, I want to emphasize that it really was my favorite part of the game. It provides a solid challenge, although some people might find the game too easy. The enemies are interesting, and I think there's enough variety. It's also fun to combo different attacks together, and it's all elevated by great visuals and presentation. When I talked about spells, I didn't mention that they aren't just used for combat. They're also the main way the game gates progression and are an important puzzle-solving tool. You spend quite a lot of time exploring and solving puzzles in between fighting enemies in Death's Door. The general formula is mostly the same for each of the major areas. You start out solving puzzles that mimic the effects of a new spell, and then about halfway through you receive a spell that allows you to progress into the second half of the dungeon, where the puzzles require the new spell that was just unlocked. It's a classic way to design dungeons, but unfortunately, the puzzles in Death's Door are just so unbelievably simplistic. They're so easy that I almost feel like it's more accurate to just view them as a way to break up combat encounters. I don't particularly hate them. They range from mildly interesting to a bit boring, but I do think they take up too much of the game if they just serve as a way to prevent players from getting tired of the combat. I think if the spells had some more unique properties outside of just being projectiles that destroy obstacles or light torches, then maybe it would be easier to create interesting puzzles. As one might expect from a game like this, there are also a ton of secrets that you can find while exploring the world. A lot of optional paths just lead to a bit of currency used to level up stats, but some of them also lead to spell upgrades, or shards that boost your health and spellcasting ability if you collect enough of them. I liked these secrets, and a lot of them were quite well hidden, but I didn't feel particularly motivated to find the shards in particular because of how many you needed to upgrade your health or spellcasting. The combat wasn't difficult enough that I felt like I needed a health boost, and it took quite a long time to even get enough to upgrade it once, so I didn't bother finding all of them. Although it wasn't that interesting to me, I'm sure some players will really like that they included so many secrets and enjoy trying to find them all, so I thought it was at least worth mentioning. I've covered gameplay pretty extensively, but Death's Door also has a story to tell about a soul-reaping corporation, death, and, of course, capitalism. I'll leave most of the details out so people can discover it for themselves, but I will give my general thoughts on the story and the characters. Like most of the things I've talked about so far, I enjoyed the story, but also had a few problems with it. The game's opening did a great job of making me feel connected with the crow you play as. The poor dude is just trying to do his job, but ends up having a really bad day and getting roped into a much larger conflict. I do think the game falters a little bit once you start hunting down powerful souls, and the story focuses more on the bosses you fight. The storytelling about each of the souls you have to collect gets progressively weaker as the game goes on. It starts out strong with the first soul being a character with interesting motivations and a personal connection with one of the characters you meet before fighting her. The second soul isn't quite as interesting and lacks the personal connection of the first, but he has a funny and charming personality, so it still kept me engaged. But by the third boss, it feels like the developers just ran out of ideas, because it's completely absent in any of the areas preceding the boss fight, and ends up just being a mindless beast. Outside of bosses, there are quite a few different characters. Most of them are at the very least entertaining, but there are only a couple that I think actually have any real level of depth to them. Which, for a short game like this, I think is totally fine. I also think the game is made more interesting by the way it mixes a relatively serious plot with a lot of absurd humor. The humor was a bit hit or miss sometimes, but it mostly worked for me. In particular, I loved the character named Pothead, who, well, is pretty self explanatory, and Jefferson, the completely normal human bartender. The ending of the game introduced a lot of interesting ideas, although they weren't explored quite as much as I would have liked. To avoid spoilers, that's all I'll say about it. Overall, I was impressed with the story of Death's Door, and it definitely added to the experience. Despite the fact that I have quite a few minor issues with the game, the overall experience of Death's Door ended up being really enjoyable. The fluid combat with a lot of different options, combined with some really interesting visuals, is broken up by solid exploration, humor, and story beats that most of the time end up making an impact. I highly recommend Death's Door to anyone looking for a solid action game to play. It's not very difficult, but it still provides a solid enough challenge on a first playthrough that I think most people will be satisfied. Thanks for watching this video. It's been almost a year since I posted a video, so sorry about that. I tried making some stuff that I didn't end up liking enough to post, but now I've decided to try something a little different. This is sort of like a test video where I want to switch to making game recommendations rather than just reviews. I'm not sure whether I'll stick with it or whether it's a good system, so let me know what you think. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time, hopefully in less than a year.